Thank you very much. Like Ellen, I'm honored and delighted to be here. My thanks to Vera for inviting me, and my thanks to Vera and Paul for their organizational nuts and bolts, having organized numerous conferences. I know how challenging that can be. Um, I want to begin with three brief vignettes. Um, In the wee hours of an August morning in 1974, prison officials found the jailer, Clarence Allagood, slumped on a bunk in the women's section of the Beaufort County Jail in rural North Carolina. His lifeless body bore 11 stab wounds, including 7 in his chest and 1 that pierced his heart. Naked from the waist down, he clutched his trousers in one hand, an ice pick dangled loosely from the other. A trail of dried semen trickled down his left thigh. A negligee and a bra hung on the cell door. The prisoner, Joan Little, was nowhere in sight. She was 5 foot 3 inches tall, 20 years old, poor, black, and in trouble. He was white, 62 years old, and at 200 pounds, nearly twice her size. On these facts, both sides could agree. Those who believed Joan Little was guilty saw a hardened criminal with the instincts of a black widow spider, a Jezebel who had lured the unsuspecting jailer into her cell with promises of sex. In the moment of its climax, the wanton young woman ruthlessly stabbed the poor, defenseless man. On the other side, feminists of all kinds, Black Power and traditional civil rights activists, seasoned women activists from the 1940s Black left and labor movements, and prison abolitionists saw a victim of sexual violence and racism, a vulnerable Black woman who had valiantly defended herself against one of the age-old and unforgivable crimes of white supremacy. But this was not simply a Southern tale, for the Joan Little case quickly became a national and international cause célèbre. After remaining on the lam for several days following her escape from the jail, Joan Little turned herself in to authorities. A grand jury quickly indicted the young Black woman for first-degree murder. If convicted, she would face the death penalty in North Carolina's gas chamber. Near the end of the 5-week trial in the summer of 1975, one of Little's defense attorneys, known for his flamboyant courtroom antics, rose to address the jury. He claimed that divine intervention had led him to a library where he discovered Gerda Lerner's Black Women in White America, a documentary history. Flipping through the pages, the lawyer came upon an article penned by an anonymous Black woman in 1902 entitled, "A Colored Woman, However Respectable, is Lower Than the White Prostitute." Reading nearly the entire piece to the packed courtroom, the skilled attorney linked Joan Little's sexual assault to the historic sexual abuse of African American women. Black women deserve justice, he insisted, reminding the jury that rape is not a sex crime. It is a crime of violence, of hatred, and that it's time that the world sees what rape is all about, he said. The jury, half Black, half white, and majority female, acquitted Joan Little after deliberating just over an hour. Today, Little is remembered as one of the first, if not the first, Black women to be acquitted after using lethal self-defense against sexual assault by a white male. Vignette number 3. In May 1973, Assata Shakur, a self-proclaimed Black revolutionary, lay gravely wounded and near death in a New Jersey hospital following a shootout with police on the New Jersey Turnpike. She would soon be charged, tried, and convicted of murder and attempted murder of 2 New Jersey state troopers, crimes she and her supporters insist she did not commit, and that medical testimony concluded that the gunshot to her right shoulder made it impossible for her to fire a weapon. In 1979, Asada escaped from prison and sought refuge in Cuba. Included on the United States' most wanted domestic terrorist list, she remained in exile in Cuba with a $2 million ransom on her head until her death last year in 2025. In her 1987 memoir, Asada Shakur recounted that those first harrowing days and nights in the hospital, where she was placed under heavy guard, beaten, and denied any contact with family or an attorney for days, and I should also add, and shackled to the bed. She wrote, "Two Black nurses were very kind to me," Asada wrote in her memoir. "While they were on duty, they would go out of their way to make sure I was all right. One night, one of the nurses came in and gave me 3 books. I hadn't even thought about reading. The books were a godsend. They had been carefully selected. One was a book of Black poetry. One was a book called Black Women in White America," Gerda Lerner's book. "When I read the book about Black women," Asada wrote, "I felt the spirits of those sisters feeding me, making me stronger. Black women have been struggling and helping each other to survive the blows of life since the beginning of time," she insisted. Vignette number 3. April 28th, 2003, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We have convened for a celebration of the life and contributions of Gerda Lerner. It is a windowless room at the university's business school. It is up to date and sterile, but at least we have comfortable seats. I can't help but wonder, is this a stab at Gerda's leftist politics? Or is the space perhaps a testament to the triumph of Gerda's decades-long struggle to make women's history a legitimate field of scholarly inquiry? From our current vantage point in 2026, however, the institutionalization of women's history and its power as a force for social change is more fragile than ever. At the end of the 2013 commencement, filled with music, poetry, photographs, and remembrances from Gerda's colleagues and former students, the moderator opens the floor to the audience in the style of a Quaker meeting. Not many care to add to what has been a moving, though lengthy, memorial. But just as the event is drawing to a close, an African-American woman sitting alone raises her hand. She stands and addresses the auditorium. She has never met Gerda, she tells us, and she knows no one in the room. She is not an academic, but a local woman from Madison. However, she felt compelled to come to the memorial because at a crucial point in her life, she found Gerda Lerner's Black Women in White America, and it saved her life. 3 Black women separated over time, background, and place. Yet all 3 lives were dramatically and powerfully affected by Gerda Lerner's documentary history of African American women. I think it's critically important to recognize that one of Gerda's most important legacies is the link between scholarship and activism. As we celebrate her pioneering accomplishments in transforming the historical profession, we cannot ignore the vital truth that scholarship can have real-life consequences, even life and death consequences, for ordinary women like Joan Little or the anonymous woman at Gerda's memorial, as well as for radical activists like Asada Shakur. I am sure there are countless ordinary people, women and men, perhaps not unlike the anonymous woman at Gerda's 2013 memorial, some of whom had never and would never set foot inside a major research university. The folks that Black freedom activist Ella Baker, a pioneer herself whom Gerda worked with in the 1950s, called the little people. And so there is a certain irony to this book, perhaps the most controversial of all Gerda's published works, at least at the time of its publication in 1972. On one of our many walks in Madison, Wisconsin, she told me, not without a trace of bitterness, although knowing Gerda, it was undoubtedly more than a trace, that she had been viciously attacked when the book came out in 1972. It was at the height of Black power and what historians would later call the emergence of identity politics. Gerda must have known the minefield she was entering, for she was hardly new to racial politics. Indeed, years later, she acknowledged that her own community activism with Black women convinced her to publish Black Women in White America, knowing that African American women had a rich and vibrant history. In true Gerda defiance mode, she also wanted to disprove the naysayers, largely fellow white male historians who insisted that no archives, no documentary existed for writing the history of Black women, and that such an endeavor, however laudable, was simply impossible, a fool's errand. Rereading the preface to Black Women in White America recently, I saw that it is certainly dated, but also that some of Gerda's insights still hold up more than half a century later, including her insistence that the project of uncovering African American history, including Black women's history, is essential, not simply for African American communities and for African American women, but for all of us. Gerda also had something to say about the role of the white historian. As a white woman who has written and taught Black women's history for many years, much of it resonates with me now in ways it would not have in the 1970s when I first discovered Gerda and her work. She wrote in the preface, quote, "No white historian can ever again approach his," and she did write his then, "his work without recognizing that there were Black people in the American past whose contributions and whose viewpoint must be considered. Scholars from outside a culture have frequently had a more challenging vision than those closely involved in and bound by their own culture," she wrote. Both angles of vision are complementary in arriving at the truth about the past, she added. Sounding a note of racial and gender essentialism that I suspect she would later reject, she continued, quote, "The interpretation of the Black past as made by Blacks must be different from that of whites. This does not mean that it can or should only be made by Blacks. It should be made by both groups, and in the clash of opinions, in debate, in the juxtaposition of different interpretations, a richer and fuller and more solidly based history will emerge," unquote. In Black Women in White America, Gerda was generally careful not to offer an interpretation of Black women's experiences, although she did provide important historical contexts for the documents she selected. In the present volume, she wrote, "I have endeavored to let Black women speak for themselves. I hope and trust that the rich material here uncovered will stimulate new interpretations and, above all, further research into the Black past." And so Gerda left it to others, primarily Black women's historians such as Darlene Clark Hine, Rosalind Terborg Penn, Deborah Gray White, Elsa Barkley Brown, Barbara Ransby, and many others, too numerous to name, who were in the vanguard of the struggle to make Black women's history a legitimate field of historical inquiry. I want to turn to a more personal note. When I entered the Sarah Lawrence College MA program in women's history in 1977, I was motivated by feminist politics more than an interest in women's history. I had a BA in English, not history. My feminist politics had been shaped in part by my undergraduate years at the City College of New York in the early 1970s, where I took a number of women's studies courses, including a life-changing course on Marxism and feminism with Joan Kelly, co-founder with Gerda of the Sarah Lawrence College Women's History MA program, and one of the U.S. pioneers in European women's history. These were the early days of women's studies, a field still fighting for inclusion and legitimacy in the academy. Although the women's studies instructors were entirely white, the students in my classes were a cross-section of New York City's diverse racial and ethnic population. I was a naive white kid from the Bronx and the suburbs of New Jersey, and I was both exhilarated and stunned by the fractious politics that arose in those courses, particularly the passionate debates surrounding issues of race, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic status or class. Only many years later did I appreciate how formative those years were and how City College had prepared me for Gerda's instruction. Although I'm not certain that this was Gerda's main purpose, the most important lesson she taught me, aside from the nuts and bolts of the historian's craft, was the significance of race in American history. I learned that it is possible to understand U.S. history without accounting for the history of racism and white supremacy, and without attention to African American experience more specifically, not only a history of survival and resistance against enormous odds, but a rich and compelling history of brilliant cultural expression, Black institution building, and so much more. In other words, African American history is U.S. history, is American history. One of the most precious gifts I received from the Women's History MA program was the deep and enduring nearly half-century friendship I still enjoy with fellow student Bonnie Johnson. Bonnie, an African-American woman, had come to Sarah Lawrence in search of the author of Black Women in White America, or as she told it, the Black woman with the funny name. She said, I'd never heard of a Black woman named Gerda, only to discover Gerda, the Austrian refugee who had survived both the Holocaust and the Red Scare, to become a pioneering women's historian. After graduating, Bonnie and I team taught a year-long multiracial women's history course for local activists in the early 1980s at what was colloquially known as the New York's Marxist School. There was no tuition, and the course created its own buzz, having attracted a group of Black, Puerto Rican, and white women radical activists. Our syllabus featured selections from Black women in white America, including the piece that Joan Little's defense lawyer had read at the closing of Little's rape murder trial. Only years later, doing research for my recent book on Joan Little, did I discover the role of Gerda's book in that trial. And I recently asked Bonnie, did she know at the time? And she said, no, she didn't know that the role that piece from Gerda's book had played in the Joan Little rape murder trial. Some years later, I received my dissertation, my PhD in U.S. history, and my dissertation topic was a local community study of women in the Black freedom struggle in Durham, North Carolina, which later became my first book. I didn't realize then that Gerda and those City College women's studies courses had shaped so much of my intellectual interests, and in fact had shaped my selection for a dissertation topic. I later went on to research and teach U.S. and Black women's history at several more traditional colleges and universities. By happenstance, I landed a job at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2002, where Gerda, who was retired at the time, had started the first U.S. PhD program in women's history. It was maybe fitting and perhaps a bit ironic that I was not hired in the history department, but in the African American Studies department, becoming the first and only white female faculty member in the department. In Madison, I forged a new, closer friendship with Gerda and learned important lessons about vulnerability and aging with dignity. Even as Gerda became more frail and sickly, her example reminded me that the struggle for human liberation is never complete. One of Gerda's last campaigns was an effort to more fully integrate the retirement residence where she spent her last years. It was far too white, she rightly complained, explaining to the director that such racial insularity prevented the place from becoming a truly exemplary and superior retirement residence. Illness kept Gerda from fully launching the battle she had envisioned, but she left us an important legacy. There is always another injustice to be fought. I want to end by closing the circle and returning to where I started with a final vignette. In all the remembrances and commemorations of Gerda's contributions, there is always commentary about Gerda's, quote, difficult, unquote, interpersonal matter. And it is important that we commemorate the fully human Gerda, flaws and all. However, I want to briefly celebrate an aspect of Gerda that is perhaps less well known. The exceedingly generous and, yes, modest Gerda. About 20 years ago, a mutual friend of ours developed cancer. We'll call her Simone, an African American woman then in her early 50s. Simone is currently retired and quite ill, but at the time she was a member of the contingent academic labor force, meaning she had no job security and earned and he had no job security, sorry, and earned about as much as a fast food worker. And like many service workers, Simone had no health insurance or benefits of any sort. Gerda decided to mount a fundraising campaign so Simone could receive the life-saving cancer surgery she so desperately needed. There was no online GoFundMe option that many desperate people turn to today. Instead, Gerda opened her address book and we sent letters to her feminist academic network, including women who had worked closely with Simone over the years. In the letter, Gerda stressed the economic insecurity that Simone had endured for decades. The letter brought in thousands of dollars, though the surgery was performed under what New York City called charity care. This was Gerda at her personal best. First, understanding at once that this was both a wrenching individual crisis for Simone as well as a larger structural injustice. Secondly, organizing and mobilizing a collective response and solution. Gerda always sought practical solutions to challenging and seemingly intractable problems. Thirdly, using her power and influence to address the immediate need. And fourth, and though I think probably less well known, neither requiring nor wanting recognition for her efforts. In the current political climate, the rise of authoritarianism in my own country and throughout the globe undermines our admittedly flawed and frayed democratic institutions. Attacks on so-called wokeness in higher education, the ever-expanding lists of banned books by schools and libraries, especially those dealing with gender and or race or sexuality, threaten the gains secured by trailblazers like Gerda and others, reminding us that our work is more vital than ever. Feminist scholarship is activism. It seems fitting to close with the wisdom of Ella Baker, the seasoned African-American organizer, accurately described by her biographer, Barbara Ransby, as a radical democratic visionary. Ella Baker commented near the end of her life and about her own half-century struggle for racial and economic justice. So how do you keep on? I don't claim to have any corner on an answer, but I believe that the struggle is eternal. Somebody else carries on. The final words in Gerda's 2002 political biography, Fireweed, are perhaps even more fitting in these perilous times. Gerda wrote, "After a forest fire rages over a mountainside, leaving everything black and charred and lifeless, there is a time when life, even the promise of life, seems to have vanished from that desolate landscape. And then, first with green shoots, then red flowers, the fireweed comes out of the barren ground, insisting on survival, pushing its persistent roots under the ashes of destruction. Soon, the black and rocky landscape is punctured by patches of small red growth, which will spread and make soil, make space for hope and future transformation, acting just as if fireweed could make a forest." I can still hear Gerda, principled, impatient, stubborn, demanding, brilliant, sometimes personally impossible, as trailblazers and pioneers often are, urging us on, exhorting us to embrace radical hope and ever bolder dreams of freedom. Thank you.